Ontario voters are heading to the poll next month. Who are the contenders and what are the top issues? I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. So it is now election time in Ontario. The votes are all drawn up. They were drawn up last week, and the electioneering is officially underway. We're hearing from the candidates. We have Doug Ford with the Conservatives looking to regain or maintain their Conservative majority government, and the NDP and the Liberals are sort of neck and neck in trying to catch them. We're also just days away from learning the results of the United Conservative Party leadership review in Alberta. We're going to find out whether Jason Kenney will remain on as leader and remain on as premier of that province. And we're also in the midst of a very hotly contested leadership race for the Conservative Party of Canada. So who better than Hamish Marshall to join the show to talk about all of these various elections. Hamish is a partner at One Persuades, which is a government relations and strategy firm based in Ontario. In 2019, Hamish served as the Conservative Party's national campaign manager, and he ran Andrew Scheer's winning leadership campaign. Prior to that, Hamish worked for Stephen Harper as his manager of strategic planning and a pollster during the successful 2008 federal election. And finally, back in 2021, during the federal election, Hamish worked for us here at True North as our in-house pollster. So Hamish, thank you so much for joining the show. It's great to have you back.
It's great to be here, Candice. It's fun.
Okay, so let's talk about Ontario. So, we're now have this election underway. It seems like Doug Ford is in a good position to maintain his election. If you look at the polls, it looks like he's up by anywhere between 3 and 8% in the polls, which is a pretty solid lead. So what do you make of the election so far? What is the sort of main issue that is driving the vote in Ontario?
Well, right now it's a bit of a snoozer election. Not a lot's happened thus far, and I think that's frankly the way the PCs like it. I mean, I think Doug Ford's running on his record. He's arguing it's not a time for change, and having a very exciting election does not seem to work with that. So he wants to emphasize continuity and change, and things are fine. And as you say, he's got a lead. Varies polling company to polling companies, but he's got a significant lead, and the consensus is that he's on track for another majority government. Although, as we've got the first debate, and things can change as well. We see over the time where we have been seeing is a little bit of growth in people warming a little bit to Stephen Del Duca, the Liberal leader, which makes things a little more interesting.
Right. Well, he's sort of relatively unknown in the province, and some of the things I've heard from him have been, I think, a little alarming, a little offside. I know he made a pledge that he would add COVID requirements for students in school, making it part of the mandatory vaccine requirements for kids coming to public schools. And I think that's still a pretty divisive, polarizing issue, whether or not to vaccinate little kids, what the benefits are for that whether they outweigh COVID, which doesn't really affect kids. Do you think COVID vaccines, the reaction to COVID, the way that Premier Ford has handled the COVID crisis, is that going to be sort of the major issue in the election, or is it something else?
I think the Liberals and the NDP are going to try to argue that COVID was mishandled by Ford. I think one of the reasons why Ford's still on track for majority government is that the general consensus, certainly amongst conservative accessible voters, is that the handling of COVID was probably fine. And doesn't mean they're okay with every decision that was made, but generally speaking, they're okay. So I think it's going to be very difficult in this springtime election to make the case, as COVID numbers continue to drop, to make the case that handling of COVID is going to be the determining factor. And I think that it would be much easier for Liberals and NDP if we were in an environment where COVID cases were rising, perhaps, if the election had been held last fall or something like that, when we were coming into whichever wave it was then.
Right. Well, I think that there are still people in Ontario that are very concerned with COVID, people that were very unhappy with the lifting of restrictions. Hamish, it seemed to me that in the beginning part of Doug Ford's premiership, he faced a lot of criticism from the media. There were a lot of protests. There was a lot of anger at sort of another conservative government, and they were sort of making it out to be this really boogeyman that was going to cut all our services and get rid of all these unions. That didn't happen. And it seems that that kind of criticism has really gone away. That the sort of centrist sort of base of the party and base of the province is actually pretty happy with Ford and the way that he managed things. The sort of most the biggest criticism that I see comes from the political right, people who are very unhappy with the lockdowns, people who didn't like the fact that Doug Ford wouldn't engage in some of the culture issues. Like, he was very quick to denounce the truckers. He didn't provide any support or any compassion, any empathy, any understanding of them. We saw this really very ideologically left-wing CRT, critical race theory, proposal coming from the Department of Education, really pushing the sort of worst of the woke ideology. Do you think that Ford faces the risk of sort of losing the base of the Conservative Party and sort of not being able to motivate his Conservative base to show up for him?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always a concern when you're in government. You have to make compromises. I think his approach to that is going to be to raise the threat of the Liberals and the NDP, and he's going to say to these voters, you might not be enthusiastic about every choice that I made, but these guys are going to be a whole lot worse. And the point you made about Del Duca talking about mandatory vaccines for all school-age kids. Well, anybody who thinks that the vaccine mandates have gone too far, Doug Ford simply has to say, "I'm not for that. That is too far for me." It's it's that if Del Duca wants to do that. And what are people going to do? They're going to, vote for they'll rather see Ford in power than Del Duca. I think it is. And the other interesting thing that's happened is that there's a whole bunch of these sort of other small splinter parties on the right. There's a bunch of MPPs that have left his caucus for a variety of reasons, some of them related to this. And some of them have started new parties. There's, I believe, the True Blue Party that Carrie Helios has started. There's a sort of a provincial version of the PPC. But because they've all splintered and there's multiple of these parties, there isn't a single focus for that feeling. There's no leader who can get into the debate. If all those MPPs had sort of joined together and said, we're all together in one caucus and we're running with one party that's going to have 120 candidates on a anti-vaccine mandate platform, they can make the case, well, we've got a couple of them MPPs, or 3 or 4 MPPs, and therefore we should have our leader in the debate. And they could really have been there to perhaps siphon off some of that support. But I think with this splintered environment, we've got 2 or 3 of these little parties plus some independents. There's no singular focus for that sentiment, and Ford's the big winner because of that.
That's a really good point. And I'm just wondering, I don't know if this is too into the weeds, but why is it that the sort of anti-establishment conservatives, people who didn't like the lockdowns, people who didn't like the handling of COVID, why do you think they're so disorganized? Why aren't they united with a singular focus in the way that we see single issue parties on the left, like the Green Party? Why do you think that these parties don't do as well on the right?
Well, I think typically if you're a libertarian party who wants to engage in these sort of debates, there's the appeal of following and making compromises with other parties that maybe you agree with them on 98% of things. These are people who have split away and they have a sort of splittist mentality. They're going to do their own thing. And if they were in favor of consolidation, many of them would have stayed inside the Ontario PC party. Same thing we saw federally with Derek Sloan not joining the PPC but going and doing his own thing. And if people have a sort of a splittist individualist ideology, that's going to continue through into how they organize a party. And it's perhaps one of the reasons why the Libertarian Party of Canada has never had a breakthrough, and why there's no anarchist party. Anarchists are very bad at organizing things, and while these people are anarchists, they generally are, they have their own specific views on things and don't want to compromise in any way, shape, or form. Compromise is why they left the big parties.
Right. That makes total sense. Okay. Well, I'm just wondering, quick question. What do you think Doug Ford has to do to maintain his majority? What is his strategy in this campaign? What does he have to do for the last three or 4 weeks here in order to win?
He's got to keep people who are broadly happy with his government on side. He's got to, and most importantly, he has to try to keep the Liberal and NDP vote split. Right now, the Liberals, it depends on the pollster, Liberals seem to be pulling away a little bit from the NDP. But, the dream scenario for Ford is that, he gets sort of somewhere in the high 30s, 38, 39% of the vote. And the Liberals and NDP each get like 26, 27%, something like that. That kind of split produce a very nice large Ford majority. Where it gets a little more difficult is there's consolidation on the left. Whereas if either Horwath or Del Duca can become the anti-Doug Ford candidate and consolidate that vote, that's when it starts getting a lot of seats begin to start falling at that point, and it becomes a little more tight for Doug Ford. It's interesting to note that Del Duca seems to be wise to this. He's already been campaigning in a whole bunch of NDP held seats and is trying to pick up those seats on his road back. And he seems to be pulling away a little bit. And I've noticed NDP strategists whining on Twitter that how dare he campaign in NDP seats. They should be focused on taking out Doug Ford. And Del Duca is doing what's best for him as opposed to what's best for the NDP. Not a surprise to really anybody but NDP strategists.
It kind of reminds me of the 2015 federal election where you had Harper was had a pretty comfortable lead and the Liberals and the NDP were sort of splitting the opposition vote, and neither Trudeau or Thomas Mulcair, leader of the NDP at the time, were really presenting themselves as a sort of premier in waiting or prime minister in waiting. And then all of a sudden at some point, Thomas Mulcair sort of misstepped. I think it was to do with hijabs and niqabs in Quebec, and just sort of his support caved all of a sudden, like midway through the election. Quebecers sort of turned on him, and Justin Trudeau was able to ride that wave. Do you foresee anything like that happening? I know Andrea Horwath this is what, her fourth time running for the NDP. She's pretty stable hand, but Del Duca is pretty new at this. What do you think about that?
Well, I think the big difference is this isn't a change election. There isn't an overwhelming desire for change. And in 2015, I think the election came out sort of an audition between Trudeau and Mulcair about who most looked like change. And Mulcair ran a bit to the center to try to soften some of those NDP hard edges and looked not different enough. And Trudeau, young and vibrant with a platform that was really throwing some hand grenades and doing things that were quite bold, looked like change and captured that vote. And I think we're starting to see that with Del Duca now. Del Duca has, not a lot is punching through. I haven't seen a lot of policy punch through in the last 10 days of the campaign. It's not getting into the public. The only thing that I've seen really punch through has been Del Duca's promise to make all transit fares $1 everywhere in Ontario for, I think it's 2 years, which is a bold policy. I mean, it's going to cost an arm and a leg, and this includes even GO train fares. So it's a huge, massive increase in subsidy, but it has punched through a little bit. So he's trying to do that. But again, they're fighting against a problem where they're still having to make the case for change. After government's been in power 8 or 10 years, you don't really have to convince people it's time for a change. People just believe that, and you're fighting over who's going to be the change agent. Right now, both the Liberals and the NDP are trying to say we have to change, and we're the best method for that, which is just a tougher argument to make. And Ford really profits from most people saying, yeah, things are pretty good. Things are fine.
Good enough, right? All right, let's move on to Alberta. So we're about a week away here from, I think we're about a week away from learning the results of the leadership review. I know they've changed it a few times, but I believe it's coming down next week. So interesting. I was in Calgary last week, and I didn't really hear a lot of people grumbling about Kenney. I heard a lot of people who were pretty happy with Kenney and pretty supportive. I think it perhaps correlates with a stronger economy, higher price of oil. But I wanted to get your thoughts on the leadership review and what you expect from that vote.
Sure. I mean, I think there's been, if you compare this to say 6 months ago, I think two fundamental things have happened for Kenney. Number one is that overall the UCP's polling against the NDP situation has dramatically improved. 6 months ago, it looked like Kenney-led UCP would be defeated by the NDP, and that was driving a lot of desire for change, as you can imagine. Now it looks like a fight, and some polls actually have them ahead. So we're looking like it's a very tight fight, but there's clearly a path to victory for Kenney-led UCP. The other thing that's happened is that, with various people announcing that they will run for leader if Kenney is defeated in this, it's no longer Kenney versus anybody's sort of dream perfect leader. It's, you don't like Kenney and who's the person after it. You can be anybody you want. You can imagine the ghost of Ralph Klein or whomever it is to come back, and they will be the dream candidate. Now with Brian Jean saying he's going to run, and Danielle Smith saying she's going to run. Like Brian and Danielle both have many things that are positive about them, but they're not perfect people. They have negatives, and now it's Kenney versus somebody else who is not a perfect dream candidate. Those things are working. The other thing that's happened, I think, for Kenney with a chunk is that some of the anti-Kenney forces really overplayed their hand. And there's a group of people now who are saying, if those types of people are attacking Kenney, maybe I'm more for him now. So I think the situation has radically evolved, and his decision to put off this vote until the spring is looking like a very, very good one. Moving to the mail-in ballot, I think was the right one to do. The in-person convention would have had so many people, it would have been absolute pandemonium. And a mail-in ballot, I think, seems like the best option. So I think what he's done is done very reasonably well, and as to your point, the economy has improved a lot, putting him in a better position.
So I have heard criticism sort of from both sides. Some people say that Kenney, part of the problem is that there is these few dissenting MLAs who are very unhappy with Kenney, and Kenney's kind of given them too long of a rope to voice their complaints and to voice their dissatisfaction, kind of giving them too much freedom. He should have had more party discipline and booted those. Others say that he's muzzling his backbench and that he's not providing them the right opportunities to have their input. Do you think there's a bigger problem, even if Kenney does survive this leadership race, which it looks like he will handily, but do you think that he has a problem just in terms of keeping this United Conservative Party united, ensuring that sort of the backbench or rural MLAs or rural Albertans who don't feel that Kenney's done a good enough job with the pandemic and he's made a lot of mistakes that aren't being addressed. How do you think Kenney can keep this big tent, big party together?
Well, number one, I think kicking MLAs out of caucus is a very serious thing and should be done only in extreme circumstances. And I think Kenney was right not to kick them all out. Kicking them all out could have formed a wrong caucus, could have given the reborn Wild Rose, I think it's now the Wild Rose Independence Party, maybe they could have joined that. They could have created something new that would have been a focus for anti-Kenney opposition. By putting everything through this leadership vote, he can now say to the caucus members, put up or shut up. If after, assuming he wins the leadership vote, he can say to any caucus members, you had your choice, you went and signed up people, the membership voted, the membership decided, I'm still the leader, I'm still the premier. I'm giving you one last chance. If you're on board now, fantastic. You can be a candidate next year. Let's move forward. But if you're not right now, it's time. The time's come for the parting of the ways. And I think he will be able to position anybody who still wants him gone after a successful leadership review is not respecting the will of the membership, and therefore removing them as an MLA, as a candidate for the next election, is entirely justified. So I think, he's given them some rope. He's certainly enhanced their criticisms. But if he pulls off a significant win in this leadership, it gives him a leadership review, much stronger hand, and he'll be in a very good position to tell them to get on board or to leave.
Interesting. I think that's a very good strategy and probably very likely how it will play out, Hamish. While I have you on the line, I want to ask you about the Conservative race because, as you know, I moderated the debate last Thursday. It was really fun. Great opportunity to sort of get to know each of the candidates a little better. Unfortunately, Patrick Brown was a no-show, but we did get to know some of the other candidates. So I'm just wondering, what's your take on the leadership race? How do you think it's going so far?
Well, full disclosure, I'm supporting Pierre Poilievre and actively helping him on his campaign. So, and these remarks represent my views, not the campaign's. So take them all. If you're not a Pierre fan, take this all as perhaps a biased perspective. But that's where I am. I agree with you. I think the debate was a lot of fun. I think we got to see who everybody was. What was important to them, and what I look for in debates is surprises. People performing about the way I expect or the way they've performed in the past isn't news. It's what's different. What new things do we learn? I think the thing that struck me that was really new was that how angry Jean Charest was. I was surprised by that. I didn't expect him to be angry, but he seemed really maddened to have to share the stage with some of the candidates. And, that was, I think, very disappointing from my perspective.
I didn't see it as anger. I saw it as passionate. I heard him make some very passionate pleas that he loves Canada and he supports it. I know that there were a couple of things that he said that did not go over well in the room. At one point, he said that he thought that the trucker convoy was illegal, and that got him a whole room full of boos. It was interesting to me because Roman Baber, who he's a provincial MPP in Ontario, he was one of the ones that we were just talking about that got kicked out of Doug Ford's caucus and went as an independent. He was really resonating with a room full of conservative sort of activists and insiders. And obviously a lot of people support Pierre because he's got the momentum and he's charismatic and he's been on the ground sort of fighting against the Trudeau government every step of the way since Trudeau was elected. But I was a little bit surprised by how much Baber's message resonated with conservatives. Do you think that this issue, the trucker convoy, the mandates, the sort of pro-freedom voice, do you think that's going to be one of the defining issues of the campaign, or do you think that there's something else that's more important?
Yeah, no, I think it's a big litmus test. I think conservatives I think at core, conservatives are looking for someone to make them feel good about being conservative. And I don't know anybody who agrees with everything that was said by everybody at the trucker convoy. I don't think that's physically possible. There's lots of people saying all sorts of different things, but at core, there was a message. There was in the Freedom Convoy, there was a message of frustration. There was a message that there's a huge chunk of Canadians, they're not being heard by this government, and respecting that, as Pierre Poilievre has done, and as Roman Baber has done, is very, very important. And I think conservatives want to feel good about being conservative again. They don't want to be lectured. They don't want to be told that they're bad Canadians. They don't want to hear that their views are somehow out of date and awful, which is what while he may not have said that, sometimes he did in so many words, but certainly what was the overall theme of the Erin O'Toole leadership. And, that's why I think one of the main reasons why I think Pierre Poilievre is winning is he's making conservatives, he's speaking to their hearts, he's making them feel good about themselves and showing a positive vision about how we can be pro-freedom and be popular. Look, I think Mr. Baber did very well. I didn't have very strong impressions of Roman Baber before the leadership debate, and I think he proved himself to be likable and interesting. And I think for someone like him who's definitely playing catch up compared to the other big contenders, I think he did very, very well.
It's sort of one of the other things that struck me is that there sort of appears to be a fault line of the old split of the party. Like when I look at the 6 candidates, I see Jean Charest, Scott Aitchison, and Patrick Brown, which very much fall in line with the sort of the old school PC, progressive, or liberal light brand of conservatism that's popular in places like Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa. And then you have more of the sort of grassroots populism. I don't want to say reactionary, but sort of really in touch with the concerns of everyday Canadians and conservatives, which would be Pierre Poilievre, Dr. Leslyn Lewis, and Roman Baber. And it sort of worries me a little bit that whichever way this party goes, the other faction of the party won't be satisfied. Like I can't imagine that Jean Charest and Patrick Brown will line up behind Pierre Poilievre if he wins. And likewise, I can't imagine people in Western Canada and people who are very dissatisfied with the status quo and with lockdowns saying, okay, I'll support a Patrick Brown or Jean Charest given their records. Is this something that concerns you, or do you think I'm sort of being oversensitive to that split?
Oh no, I mean I think there's always a danger of splits, and I think what we've seen, I always like to say the conservative movement is sort of deeply Protestant in character. It's not to say there aren't just Protestants in the conservative movement, but there's sort of a splittist tendency that when things aren't going the way we want, certain factions will break off, and I think that. So I always think there's a danger of it. I generally think that, however, though, that we're going into an election where Trudeau will be in power for a decade, Liberals in power for a decade, and the tendency for unity in the face of that kind of a environment is much, much, much greater. And I think there'll be a strong push for unity, whoever wins afterwards. And the Conservative Party has a fairly good record of pulling that together. And especially if we have a leader who is sensitive to some of the mandates concerns. I think even what we'll see is a greater unity with a chunk of PPC voters coming back to the Conservatives as well.
I think that's right. It was interesting because I think it was Warren Kinsella started calling Pierre Poilievre People's Party Pierre. which I don't think is that as big of an insult as he thinks it is. But I did find it amusing that I think both Roman Baber and Leslyn Lewis took shots at Pierre and the federal Conservatives for not doing enough to defend the trucker convoy and the and being anti sort of lockdown mandate enough. So that was an interesting debate. I didn't agree with much that the media said about the debate afterwards, but there was one thing that I did agree with. It was written in the Hub, which is a policy sort of more of a wonkish publication, but there's sort of complaints that the debate didn't feature enough big ideas and it wasn't policy oriented enough, and that they didn't really put down anything in terms of what they believed in and what their vision for Canada was in specific ways. Do you think that's just because it's too early in this race? I know we're not going to determine the leader until September, so it's so early, there's so much time. But do you think that the debate and the conversation so far has been lacking when it comes to public policy?
I disagree. I think we've seen some interesting public policy proposals around housing prices, around cryptocurrency. Mr. Schrade put out a big healthcare piece recently. There's been a fair bit, but they're all subservient to the overall narrative, which is, the Schrade Brown approach, which says conservatives shouldn't be conservative and they should feel bad about being conservatives. And if only we were just liberals who were good at math, everything would be fine. And then there's what Mr. Poilievre is showing, which is that, it's okay to be conservative. Not just okay, it's great to be conservative, to feel and to fight for freedom and to make people feel that they're part of something that is growing. And so I see two very different narratives, and all the policy gets assumed by that. It's a very different race than it was, say, in 2017, where we had 13 candidates on the stage, where people needed individual policies to stand out from one another, and it became about that. Here, it's really a campaign of big narratives.
Do you think that at this point that any of the campaigns are really using a strategy of like, okay, my goal is to get second round votes and I'm going to try to appeal to this person's base? Do you think that's part of the strategy game has really started to play in yet, or do you think it's too early? And then also on that, what do you think about Patrick Brown's strategy to not debate, not talk to media, not really engage, kind of stand back and lob grenades, while also sort of working with diaspora communities and immigrant communities to try to shore up support amongst people who probably have never voted Conservative before?
Yeah, look, I think both the Schrade and Brown campaigns have the similar strategy, which is, do well enough on the first ballot to keep Pierre under 50%, and then get most of the seconds of the other, right? They're both assuming that they will be ahead of each other and that they can profit from that, and that's their path to victory. So I think that very much exists on that side of things. Mr. Brown has been described as he's running a submarine campaign, which I think is good. I think you're right. He's sort of firing the odd torpedo, but he's generally keeping it under the radar. And he's running a campaign very much about signing up people in very specific communities. He came out and said that he was in favor of taking the Tamil Tigers off the terrorist list, which is an explicit appeal to people who are supporters of Tamil Tigers. He's come out and said, it was reported, he came out and said that he's against moving the Canadian embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. He's very much targeting very specific communities, and has explicitly said many times that he's not interested in appealing to the traditional membership. And he's going to sign up enough people to go around them and win that way. It's a bold strategy, a risky strategy. It creates all sorts of trouble. Should he be successful with caucus and with the party establishment and the party as it exists? So we'll see how far he gets with that. But I actually think the most dangerous is that if he wins, is keeping the party together, having if that strategy is successful, keeping the party together is going to be very, very difficult by signing up an entirely new group of people who've never had any connection with the Conservative Party.
I mean, I can't fathom that happening. But yeah, certainly an interesting strategy, one that we haven't seen, and it will be interesting to keep an eye on that. Well, Hamish, I really appreciate all your insights on all these various campaigns, and we appreciate you having on your show. We'll have to have you back on later to give an update on these topics.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you so much. That's Hamish Marshall. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is The Candice Malcolm Show.